In the fertile plains near the Jordan rose the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, shining in wealth and abundance. Yet their hearts were sunk deep into darkness, corruption, violence, and unrestrained lust. Their inhabitants prospered in trade and agriculture, but they neglected justice, love, and compassion, replacing goodness with greed and turning pleasure itself into their highest and most dangerous deity. With every generation, the sins of the cities intensified, like a spreading stain slowly corrupting the entire moral fabric of a nation. Men, women, and even the young despised the law of the Creator, mocking tradition and ridiculing every trace of purity or holiness that still remained. The cries of the oppressed poor, the rejected foreigners, and the forgotten victims rose to the heavens like corrupted incense, pleading for justice before the eternal throne. The very soil seemed to cry out, soaked by the tears of the innocent, while heaven bore witness to the horrors committed under the shadows of night in Sodom and Gomorrah. The Creator, long-suffering and patient, did not ignore the ceaseless outcry, but waited to see if even a spark of repentance would appear in hardened hearts. Yet the hardness was complete, and arrogance had become law, while compassion vanished like dew beneath the burning desert sun. The kings of the cities exalted their glory, building ornate palaces, but their streets hid misery, degradation, and a people surrendered to depravity. Even travelers from distant lands reported the scandals and perversions they witnessed, spreading the fame of Sodom and Gomorrah as symbols of absolute debauchery. The contrast was so striking that even pagan nations, far from the covenant, trembled at the practices of these condemned cities. Amidst this scene, the righteous Abraham lifted his eyes to the heavens, his spirit stirred by the revelation of the Lord. The Most High came down to investigate not because knowledge was lacking, but to manifest his justice before men and angels alike. 2 heavenly messengers were appointed as living witnesses, carrying the light of holiness that would expose the hidden darkness of the squares and houses of those cities. As the angels descended, the skies seemed to grow heavy, as if unseen clouds of judgment were gathering over Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham in his tent was visited by the Lord, who revealed the gravity of sin and the imminent judgment prepared. Before this revelation, the patriarch trembled, but dared to intercede, for he knew his nephew Lot lived in Sodom. The dialogue between Creator and servant still echoes, "If there are 50 righteous in the city, will you truly destroy the place?" The Lord answered that he would not destroy it for the sake of 50, proving his justice never ignores the cry of the innocent. Abraham in humility pressed further. What if only 45 are found? What if only 40 remain? At each plea, the Almighty reaffirmed his mercy, willing to spare the city if even a small remnant of righteousness was found. Abraham continued, lowering the number to 30, 20, and even 10. And the divine answer remained, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." Abraham's heart found rest, yet it still burned with worry, for he knew the corruption of Sodom's streets. The angels advanced in their mission, carrying with them the irresistible presence of the sacred into the mud of human corruption. The city, blind to what was coming, continued its routine of feasts, shady dealings, and illicit pleasures. The markets were crowded, the houses echoed with impure laughter, and the night once more promised endless excess. Yet above the laughter, another sound echoed. The sound of judgment, unseen by human eyes, yet inevitable in God's appointed time. For when the cry of the wronged reaches the heavens, the Creator does not remain silent, but prepares his mighty hand to act. Just as a river fills until it overflows, the sins of Sodom had reached the unbearable limit before the eternal. No word, deed, or thought was hidden, for the heavenly book recorded every act of violence and corruption. The city gates, which should have welcomed foreigners, had become portals of mockery, where travelers were ridiculed and exploited. The squares, meant to be places of justice, had turned into stages of indecency and public abuse. The outcry was so intense that even the angels descending felt the weight of their mission pressing upon their wings. It was not only Sodom, but Gomorrah and the neighboring cities that shared the same spirit of lawlessness. Corruption had become so natural that none recognized evil as evil anymore, nor sin as sin. And when depravity becomes culture, truth is persecuted, and justice is turned into a subject of mockery. Abraham observed from afar, knowing that the fate of those cities would be an eternal example to every future generation. And like a father crying for lost children, he silently hoped that at least 10 would still be found. But in the alleys, in the banquets, and in the beds of impurity, only arrogance, disdain, and pride reigned. The poor were trampled, widows forgotten, foreigners abused, and the innocent silenced without pity. There was no space left for compassion, no trace of mercy, only an emptiness fueled by an insatiable hunger for sin. Heaven waited in silence, the angels advanced with firmness, and the earth trembled though its people did not perceive it. The clock of eternity marked the exact hour when divine patience would reach its final limit. The descent of the angels was the prelude to a display of justice humanity would never forget. Night fell over Sodom, its lights shone as usual, yet unseen torches of judgment were already lit in the heavens. The destiny of that city, once a fertile garden, was now moving toward becoming a barren desert of eternal ashes. The voices of the wronged still echoed, while the majority laughed, drank, and celebrated their own ruin without awareness. Yet the march of judgment cannot be halted when the outcry reaches heaven and iniquity reaches its limit. Thus ended the first act of the story, not yet with punishment, but with the certainty that judgment was near. And in that silent night, before the angels reached Lot, the heavens had already written Sodom's destiny in the stars. When the two angels arrived at Sodom at evening, shadows already covered the city, yet their celestial glory shone in stark contrast against the deep spiritual darkness ruling that place. Lot was seated at the city gate, a position of public observation, and quickly recognized the uncommon dignity of the visitors before him. Without hesitation, he rose hurriedly, bowed his face to the ground in reverence, and offered them immediate hospitality without reservation. "My lords, please come to your servant's house, spend the night there, wash your feet, and rise early in safety." The angels initially declined, saying they would remain in the square, but Lot insisted strongly, knowing the corruption that reigned in the streets. They accepted, and Lot led them into his house, prepared a meal, and served unleavened bread to honor them. The scene seemed peaceful, but the spiritual darkness of the city was about to reveal its most cruel face. Before they lay down, the men of the city surrounded Lot's house from the young to the old, united in depravity. They shouted loudly, "Where are the men who entered your house tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may abuse them." The swelling crowd represented the complete degradation of Sodom, where sin was no longer hidden but celebrated openly and shamelessly. Lot went outside, closed the door behind him, and desperately attempted to calm the furious men pressing upon his home. "I beg you, my brothers, do not commit such wickedness, for the dishonor you seek falls directly before the heavens." But the mob's cries only intensified, mocking Lot's pleas, calling him an arrogant foreigner who dared to act as their judge. In desperation and folly, Lot offered his 2 virgin daughters, saying, "Do to them as you please, but do not touch these men." The city's sickened heart was revealed. They refused, proving their target was not flesh but the holiness shining from the angels. "Stand aside, Lot. This foreigner dares to judge us. Bring the men out at once," shouted the enraged mob. They rushed violently at Lot, pressing against the door until the angels intervened, pulling him back safely into the house. Then they stretched out their hands and struck all the men outside with blindness, from the least to the greatest. Confused and desperate, they groped around the house, unable to find the entrance, stumbling in darkness that mirrored their spiritual blindness. Divine power not only blinded their eyes but symbolically exposed the misery of hearts hardened by lust and violence. Inside, the angels revealed to Lot the gravity of the situation. "Do you have anyone else belonging to you in this city?" They commanded him to gather sons-in-law, sons, daughters, and all who belonged to him, because destruction was now inevitable. "The outcry against this city has grown so great before the Lord that he has sent us to destroy it without delay." Lot went immediately and spoke with the men pledged to marry his daughters, but they laughed at him as if it were a joke. "Get up, leave this place, for the Lord will destroy the city." Lot implored, but they mocked him. Their hearts were so hardened that even with destruction imminent, they chose laughter over repentance, mockery over deliverance. The night advanced, and the weight of judgment became heavier, while the city remained drowned in sin and blind pleasure. Lot returned home, distressed, as the angels repeated the urgency. "Arise quickly, take your wife and your daughters out of this place." For the entire city was destined to be consumed, and there would be no refuge within its walls. Even then, Lot hesitated, gripped by fear and anguish, unable to comprehend the full gravity of the moment before him. The angels seized him by the hand, along with his wife and daughters, and led them forcefully outside the city. The mercy of the Lord reached them, for without divine help Lot would never have escaped a city that had ensnared him. Once outside, one of the angels spoke, "Flee for your life, do not look back, and do not stop in the plain. Escape to the mountain, lest you be consumed together with the city destined to be destroyed by fire." The command was clear, yet Lot still trembled. "No, Lord, the destruction is too great, I fear I cannot reach the mountain." He pleaded instead to flee to a small nearby town called Zoar, and in mercy, the angel granted his request. The night still held its silence, but the sentence had already been written, and Sodom was marked for dust. The men who had surrounded Lot's house stumbled blindly through the streets, still seeking pleasure but finding only disgrace. Their cries echoed through the night, proving that physical blindness was only a reflection of the spiritual blindness consuming them. Every street, every corner, every house stood as a silent accomplice to the collective sin, now demanding judgment. While Lot and his family were led by mercy, the city slept unaware that dawn would be its final morning. The stars shone above as silent witnesses, recording in heaven the perversion that had finally reached its limit before the Creator. The contrast was striking. Inside Lot's home, divine light preserved a family. Outside, the reign of sin consumed the multitude. The blindness upon the men was more than punishment. It was a sign that judgment would no longer be delayed. For when even the heavenly messengers become targets of violence, the cup of divine wrath has already overflowed beyond return. Lot's heart raced, torn between fear and obedience, but there was no longer room for hesitation or delay. The angels raised their voices once more. "Hurry, for the Lord will bring destruction before the sun rises upon this place." And in that heavy night of silence and dread, the streets of Sodom held the prelude to the greatest catastrophe yet. The destiny of the city was sealed, and no plea or tear could reverse the sentence written already in heaven. And thus, as the first rays of dawn approached, Sodom unknowingly prepared itself for its final encounter with eternal fire. As dawn advanced, the angels firmly grasped the hands of Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters, leading them away from the city soon to be consumed by fire. The command thundered in their ears, "Flee for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stop anywhere in the plain." The mandate was not only physical instruction, but a spiritual warning, for looking back meant longing for the condemned sins of Sodom. Lot's heart still trembled with hesitation, torn between the life left behind and the promise of salvation through divine mercy. His possessions, his home, his status within the city, all would be consumed, leaving only life preserved by God's compassion. The family hurried onward, yet each step seemed heavy, as if invisible chains bound them to everything left behind. Lot's wife walked silently, her eyes on the ground, but her heart burned with longing for the pleasures of Sodom. Dawn approached, and the skies already glowed red, as if foreshadowing the fire about to descend from heaven. The angel commanded, "Escape to the mountain, do not stay in the plain, for destruction will fall even there." But Lot feared and said, "No, my lord, I am afraid disaster will overtake me before I reach the mountain." He pleaded instead for permission to take refuge in a small nearby town called Zoar, and in mercy, God granted this request. Thus, as judgment approached, Lot and his family fled toward Little Zoar, carrying only the urgency of survival. Behind them, Sodom still slept, unaware it would soon be swept away by the most terrible judgment of heaven. The first rays of the sun rose over the horizon, illuminating the last moments of a city drowning in corruption. Every step of the escape was broken only by the sound of wind and the pounding of fearful hearts. The heavens, once silent witnesses, now stood ready to unleash the fury of divine judgment without hesitation. Lot's daughters clung to his hands tightly, trembling not only at destruction but at the terrifying uncertainty of the future. His wife, however, walked reluctantly, her soul still chained by the bitter memories of wealth and pleasures left behind. The angels went before them, like living torches of holiness, guiding the fugitives through the plain toward the promise of life. Time seemed stretched, every minute bearing the weight of eternity, and the tension grew unbearable with each step. It was as though all creation held its breath, awaiting the moment when fire would fall from the heavens. The wind carried the dry scent of the earth, mingled with the foreboding of ashes soon to fill the air. Lot's heart pounded like a war drum, knowing that hesitation for even a moment could mean certain death. In the distance, Zoar appeared small and unimpressive, yet to Lot it shone as his only hope for survival. The angels repeated their command once more. "Do not look behind you, for a backward glance of longing brings certain death." Yet those words seemed to echo in vain within Lot's wife, who still cherished the memory of lost treasures. The plains reflected the contrast between God's mercy preserving a few and his justice preparing to consume the many. The sun rose higher, its light marking the final limit of divine patience as judgment pressed ever closer. No fire had yet fallen, but the skies burned with a glow like embers awaiting only the final command. Every hurried step became a test of faith, each meter placing them farther from the place marked for destruction. Lot's wife, however, could not bear the weight of leaving behind what her heart still called precious. And so, in the midst of the flight, her resolve broke and her eyes turned backward against the command. In a single instant, the turning of her head sealed her fate, and her body was transformed into a pillar of salt. There, between life and death, stood an eternal monument of warning against hearts that cling to condemned desires. Lot and his daughters pressed forward in tears, unable to stop the judgment that had consumed their wife and mother. The silence that followed was heavier than 1,000 cries, as sorrow pierced their hearts like a sharpened blade. Each step toward Zoar became a reminder that disobedience exacts its price, leaving scars no one can erase. The desert wind scattered grains of salt across the ground, a testimony of what happens to those who love the world more than life. Their march did not stop, for judgment was already in motion, and there was no return for those who looked back. The small city of Zoar drew nearer, yet the absence of the wife and mother became a wound that would never heal. The sun now rose fully, and the earth seemed to tremble in anticipation of the fire about to fall. The angels, in solemn silence, urged the family onward, knowing the appointed moment of destruction was only heartbeats away. Lot, in tears, gripped his daughter's hands even tighter, aware that only mercy kept them alive until that moment. The memory of his wife turned to salt became proof that no divided heart could stand in the face of judgment. Zoar finally appeared before them, small and insignificant, yet in that moment it represented the difference between life and death. The wind carried faint echoes from Sodom's streets, still filled with laughter and sin, oblivious to the doom closing in. Lot's daughters, still young, looked back only in thought, trembling at the memory of their mother lost to disobedience. The skies seemed to open wide, preparing the stage for justice, while the earth awaited the weight of eternal fire. Zoar now stood as their refuge, yet behind them remained the stage prepared for the final act of destruction. And so, as Lot and his daughters stepped into Zoar, the judgment was ready to be unleashed without return. When Lot and his daughters finally reached Zoar, the heavens, which had remained silent, now prepared to unleash judgment upon the corrupted cities. The newborn sun painted the horizon with golden tones, yet hidden among the clouds burned embers awaiting only the Creator's command. Then the Lord rained down fire and sulfur from heaven upon Sodom, Gomorrah, and the entire plain, consuming them completely. Houses, markets, palaces, and gardens were swallowed by flames, erased as though they had never existed. The fire did not rise from the earth but descended from heaven, so all would know it was divine judgment, not human disaster. The laughter that filled the streets was turned into screams of despair, quickly drowned out by the roar of consuming fire. Lust, pride, and violence were buried beneath burning ashes, and the fleeting glory of the cities became eternal dust. The ground trembled as though creation itself could not endure the sight of wrath being poured out. Columns of smoke rose to the heavens, forming a dark memorial to be remembered by every generation yet to come. The fountains that once nourished the plain evaporated instantly, leaving only barren craters and scorched ruins. The green of the fields vanished, replaced by ash and silence, as though life had never dwelt there. Animals, men, women, and children. All were consumed, for none had repented while time was still offered. The destruction was absolute, leaving not a trace that human hands could ever rebuild. The smoke rising served as witness before God and mankind, proclaiming that sin always ends in inevitable judgment. That fertile valley, once compared to the Garden of Eden, had become a symbol of desolation and eternal shame. Meanwhile, Lot and his daughters gazed from afar, horrified by the fiery spectacle that consumed everything they had once known. Their eyes reflected both the sorrow of loss and the terror of God's overwhelming power. There was no joy in survival, only a profound silence, for they knew they had escaped solely through mercy. Every flame that reached the sky reminded them that the Creator is just, and that his patience has a limit. Lot's wife, now a pillar of salt, remained as visible proof that no divided heart can stand in judgment. His daughters wept, not only for their mother, but for the destruction of an entire land within mere moments. The muffled cries remained only in memory, for the fire had consumed even the sound of life. Rivers dried up, trees vanished, and the wind carried only ashes, as though sweeping across an eternal graveyard. Abraham, watching from afar, saw the smoke rise like a furnace, and knew the Lord had fulfilled his word. He remembered his intercession, and realized not even 10 righteous had been found within that land. His heart was grieved, yet he acknowledged the holiness of God, who does not leave evil unpunished. The contrast between Abraham's humble tent and the cities in ashes became a living message of where true safety rests. For it is not in wealth, nor in human power, but in obedience to the Creator that life is secured. The wind carried the stench of sulfur across the region, engraving into memory the weight of divine judgment. Travelers who later passed by would see only desolation, telling stories of the wrath of the Almighty. The plain, once envied for its fertility, had become a curse, a land where nothing could flourish again. And so Sodom and Gomorrah disappeared from the earth not by enemy hands, but by the hand of the Creator himself. Lot remained in Zoar with his daughters, but the weight of memory never left his shoulders. Each morning he saw the sunrise, remembering the dawn when fire had fallen. Each breeze reminded him of laughter turned into screams. Each silence of the night recalled the final silence that overtook the destroyed cities. Zoar was a refuge, but also a living reminder that no man can trifle with the holiness of God. Lot's daughters grew under the mark of having witnessed what the entire world feared. The vision of flames never left their eyes, and the shadow of their mother turned to salt haunted their memories. The valley, now in ruins, became a school for every generation, teaching that corruption always ends in ashes. Just as the rainbow reminded of mercy after the flood, the smoke of Sodom reminded of justice through judgment. No man, however powerful, was able to resist when fire fell from heaven. No woman, however wealthy, could protect her children from the flame that devoured. No leader, however influential, could rise against the decree of the Most High. Everything was silenced in an instant, as though a breath from the eternal extinguished the flame of human arrogance. And in the place where feasting and lust once reigned, only silence and ash remained. The wind sang like a lament, scattering the memories of the lost city, carrying with it the message of eternal justice. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah was sealed not only in ashes, but as a warning engraved in the human heart. That destroyed valley became an altar of memory, reminding all that the Creator is just holy and avenger of evil. And so ended Sodom, not as legend, but as living testimony that the holiness of God will never be overcome by corruption.